Hey everyone, welcome in. I sure hope you can hear me. This is Frank Quinn, Director of Preservation for Heritage Ohio, and I am happy and excited because it is May, and May can only mean one thing for the historic preservationists, and that is Preservation Month. So we have a couple special webinars in May that are geared toward design review. So makes sense, obviously, to start off with a Design Review 101. Whether you're new to Design Review, whether you're an affiliate organization member who works with people in Design Review, or whether you need a brush up on your Design Review, I think you've come to the right place this afternoon. We will have Nathan Bevil of the State Historic Preservation Office give us an overview of the design review process and all the great things that come with it. I guess before I turn it over to Nathan, who I can tell you is a Southern gentleman of impeccable character, but I will let him finish his introduction. A couple housekeeping items. I suppose if you have problems with your GoToWebinar audio quality or visual quality, you can always try closing and reopening the program. If that doesn't work, you try shutting off your computer and turning it back on maybe. Hopefully that will fix any problems that you come across. For Heritage Ohio, as part of Preservation Month, we have our annual photo contest going right now, and we are accepting entries. If you're interested in learning more or submitting an entry, go to heritageohio.org. Check out our scroll of posts across the top of the page, and we'll have information on the Preservation Month photo contest. Click on that and learn more about it. As with all of our webinars, we are interested and excited to take your questions, and we are ready to do so. We'll have Nathan go ahead and go through his slides. If you have questions, just open up the question box there in the navigation pane, type in your question, and hopefully we should have time to get to all of those questions. So at this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to Nathan. And also I want to just make a special call out to our technical guy, Devin Miles. He's been with us for many years. He is always ready. He always has the answer to our technical solutions, or solutions to our technical problems. So thank you, Devin, for joining us today also. So without further ado, Nathan.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nathan Bevil with the State Historic Preservation Office. I'm sure some would argue, Frank, that I'm not quite the Southern gentleman, since technically I was born in Maryland, so whatever. But I do have my bachelor's degree in historic preservation and history from Mary Washington College, and my master's degree from the University of Georgia. And I wasn't sure if I'd actually be visible in this, so I actually made sure to wear red and black today. So yeah, we at least got that going for me. But at the State Historic Preservation Office, I oversee the Certified Local Government Program, which I'll get into in a little bit. And I also do some tax credit reviews and work with the statewide historic preservation plan. And so today's topic is going to be Design Review 101, where I'm going to talk about historic preservation commissions, which is just a broad term for any board or commission in the state that deals with historic preservation. And then there's no regulation on that. You can call it a number of different things, but just so you know, I'm using the term HPC/Historic Preservation Commission. And then also the details of what goes into that work and what you need to do to get started with that. So I always like to have a good agenda, just so you know where we're going. First and foremost, looking at local preservation laws and ordinances. Then we're going to jump to commission operations, what actually goes into the back behind the scenes work of the commission. Then the actual work of the HPC, which is the meat and potatoes of what you're going to do in a typical meeting. And then get in some additional resources. And then I hope to leave plenty of time so we can have some discussion, answer some questions, and really just open up the floor to have some talking about what your next steps might need to be. So in looking at local preservation laws, most of these across the country are based in either zoning or planning. Most communities, it's under zoning as part of public welfare that a local government is able to regulate, I hate to use the R word, but regulate property rights to help the public welfare. This is the same kind of laws that would impact the use of your property if you have a commercial versus a residential zoning, or if you have more of a different kind of a code system. It's helping to have that regulation so they just have some statement about use of the property and design of the property. In some cases, if you're like Houston though, and zoning is a bit more of an issue, in some cases it's a little bit more like a planning related document. Everything is based on designation. So you have an ordinance set up that sets up the functions, an enabling ordinance. And that enabling ordinance then allows a commission to then designate historic properties. So you would identify your historic resources, what's valuable in your community, what's historic in your community, and then you're able to both identify and designate districts and individual sites. And the general goal of all of this work is protecting local character, but also protecting the historic fabric related to that character. There are a couple different types of ordinances. The one we're focusing on primarily today is going to be what I would call the traditional Historic Preservation Commission. This is designation and the regular design review, where you're looking at what's going on with the building, what proposed changes are, and how it's going to be compatible with the historic building and the historic district. Some communities have done what's called a conservation district, which some people call it preservation light, but in these cases, there's less of a legal definition of conservation districts in this model, but it's a very local designation of what people want. And this might be that it stops demolition or pauses demolition, or has very broad regulations that allow most things to happen, but it's not quite a historic district. It's not the same level of designation and not quite the same level of control. And then there are other things which are more hyper-local, which is where commissions might just have a demolition only, or they have something based on specific classes of buildings, like if they only do commercial district, for example. This again, similar to conservation, it's based on what the local community wants and needs to protect the resources that they have. What goes into particularly a traditional ordinance element is one, establishing the Historic Preservation Commission. This would have membership requirements, which, for example, you may have an architect that's going to sit on the commission, that you might cycle in and out of having an architect or a couple different architects in your community. You might have a local historian who understands the history of the community, can help with designation procedures. Or you might just have business owners who understand what business goes on in the community, what business owners are being pressured to do, or what's kind of been popular, and to help provide all of that very distinct variety and color to that local commission, what's going on. There are no hard and fast requirements unless you're doing something like the Certified Local Government Program. But generally speaking, it's making sure you have professionals on the board who can help you make very good decisions and very well-reasoned decisions. The ordinance also sets up the commission duties, which may include doing survey work. It may include doing other types of reviews. Some communities I work with have other design review that they do outside of the historic district. Some of them are more involved with outreach and with public education. And so it sets up what are all of the different duties of the commission. What do they need to do? The ordinance also sets up the designation procedure. This is the who and the how of designation. Who can initiate the local designation, and how do you do it? What is the actual process? Is it going through local commission, and then it goes through another planning board, and then it goes to city council? Does it go through just the preservation commission and then to a village council? What is the actual process? Who are the people that are actually involved? And also, as a part of that, this may also set up what is included in the designation. For example, are you going to have landscaping involved, or are you going to have outbuildings? Sometimes this might sound kind of crazy that, my community, we're just looking at downtown, we don't care about that. But for example, if you are in Glendale, which has a very rich landscaped district, you would be looking at landscaping, that might be something you would consider having included in your designation, and then offering some level of say in the design review process for that landscape. Or if you have somewhere like Lebanon, who has a lot of historic outbuildings, 1920s garages, all of those kinds of buildings that, sure, it may not be your main house, but if they are visible and they are actually contributing to that historic district, they might be worthy of that preservation. And then finally, what the ordinance is doing is setting up the design review process. What do people have to submit? What are the regulations and guidelines on the commission for how they do the design review process? What is the process for appeals of any of those decisions? And generally giving the legal framework for how that decision is going to be made. The reason you have that legal framework is to make sure that you do not violate due process and takings regulations that have been laid out by the Supreme Court. 1978, the Penn Central versus New York case was finally handed down by the Supreme Court. This actually involved not Penn Station in New York City, but Grand Central Terminal in New York City that the Penn Central Railroad had wanted to demolish, but the city of New York had designated as a local landmark and therefore told Penn Central you are unable to demolish it. The Penn Central Railroad fought that decision, and it wound its way through the courts. And in 1978, they affirmed that designating historic buildings is legal under the Constitution, and that design review is also legal, provided both of those are provided that due process is given to the decision-making process, both designation and design review, which means having the owner being involved and all the other public elements that go into that there's a proper process being followed, and that it is avoiding a taking, which I have very rarely seen used in historic preservation cases, but generally this is when you take away all use of the historic building through that legal designation. So now we're going to switch over and look a little bit at actual commission operations. First and foremost, you have your regular duties as a commission. This is basically, all these here are your bread and butter, what you're planning to do with any local commission you work with. Number one, making sure you have accessible professional meetings, initiating a survey of resources, doing designation, design review, and then finally working on outreach. For meetings, one of the things that I think is highly important that sometimes gets lost is making sure that you have accessible meetings. This first and foremost means that they're actually ADA compliant, that you have the ability for anyone with any mobility or any other impairment, that they are able to get in and are able to participate in the meeting. And I have heard from a number of different commissions that they have seen a great increase in participation in doing digital work. So that may be something that we have to work with the state and seeing about getting that extended or getting some additional work on that, because some communities find that that digital access has been a great boon to allowing more people to participate in attendance. It's making sure that your meetings are announced in advance and with an agenda, so that if you know something is going to be coming up on the agenda, you as, say, a neighboring property owner are able to actually participate. This is also similar to having signs on any historic buildings that might actually be having their meetings. So you have that advertised in advance, and you have that ability to actually know what is going on in the community. And then finally, that all meetings are actually going to be open to the public, that you're not holding and making all these decisions, particularly with designations and design review, all in some secretive meeting, that you're actually having this. It's a public function. Everyone is invited and everyone is able to participate in the meeting as needed. As a part of this, you're also making sure that you're keeping proper meeting records. Number one, make sure that your minutes actually reflect the general discussion as well as the votes. Some communities I've worked with have just said, there was discussion, we voted to approve. But if there was some disagreement, or if there was some discussion that helped lead people to a decision, this would be something I think should be reflected in those minutes. So you had the characterization of what went into that discussion. You're able to share that information with the public and have that recorded in the minutes. Also make sure that when you actually make a vote, that it actually cites the ordinance or design guidelines that you are using to make your decision. So when you say, yes, I approve the addition of this sign, it's in accordance with standard or ordinance section 5, paragraph 2, or design guidelines, page 5, section 5, whatever it might be, so that you make sure that you actually have that legally defensible decision, that it's actually rooted in a ordinance or something more solid, as opposed to, I just think that sign's really ugly, I don't like it, I don't want to do that, I don't think they should do that, or I think it's really cool and they're my buddy and I kind of want to approve that. Neither of those are really good examples of what to say when you're dealing with one of these meetings. Also make sure that you follow any and all applicable sunshine laws. Follow your established rules of procedure. Those are there for a reason. Yes, it may seem, if there's not that much on the agenda, that you don't really need to do a motion to do this or a motion to do that or to do any of that kind of work. Nevertheless, it's important to keep with those procedural steps. They're there for a reason. And if you get out of step, or if you create a shortcut, it can really create a problem. Always make sure you keep all meetings professional. Again, saying I don't like it or I think that's ugly is just a matter of personal taste. If it's not in violation of the ordinance, then you may need to just kind of shelve that opinion until at least everything is closed out, the meeting is adjourned, microphones are off, and it's outside of that. No one's saying that you're not allowed to kind of grumble about something, but it's making sure that any of those personal opinions or asides are left outside of that meeting forum. If there are any questions about whether there is a conflict of interest, recuse yourself. I go so far as to say, if you have something, an explicit personal attachment to one of these issues or one of the cases before you, I would actually recommend leaving the room. This is especially true if you're an architect or designer associated with the project and you're sitting on the boards. You can say a lot with some side eye. You can say a lot with just smirks or whatever facial expressions, and you want to make sure that your applicant is able to have a completely unbiased opinion and one that is not going to be legally questioned because you happen to sit in and vote on that same issue. Because remember, again, everything that a public commission does is going to be public. As a part of this public aspect, it's also important to make sure that the commission is approachable. This is not, 5, 6, 9 people sitting on a dais and kind of just designating and just kind of making all these rulings that these are your neighbors, these are people you need to trust, and they're helping you make decisions. So you may want to do an open house that helps property owners come in, meet with commissioners, and understand what they need to do, who's actually involved on the board. They're not scary. You may need to come up with brochures or handouts for new owners. Some communities, they essentially work with the real estate community to give new property owners some kind of handout that lets them know that they're in the historic district, what they need to bring up for review, what's going to be expected in the meeting. Make sure they have all of that information up front rather than it being a surprise when they get a citation later on. And then it's important to just find any other way that you can have a creative way to show the commission presence. That, whether that's doing a May Preservation Month activity or doing something that just highlights that the commission is there and that they're there to help the community. Part of that is just looking beyond simply doing regulation. You may decide that you want to do a public education program, such as the Building Doctor program, which my office hosts. This is essentially where we have a seminar, and then we have private property owners. We do site visits to their buildings to help tell them and diagnose issues and help tell them how they might be able to fix those issues. Other communities have done historic marker programs or an annual awards program. If there's been a great preservation rehab, they might want to go in and do an award, or if they have historic markers, I've seen Oxford used to tie those together and would do a big shindig and have, a speaker come in and award a plaque to a great rehab job on a house and all those kinds of things to just help and bring that together and raise that awareness of historic preservation. And then finally, making sure you would partner with organizations like Main Street or your local history groups, local historical societies, making sure that you just have that partnership and you're able to work with some of those people outside of that, internal little bubble. Another thing to look at is annual self-improvement. And this is especially true if you're actually sitting on the commission. This is one most commissioners I talk with groan, but then agree that they probably should do this, is read your ordinance. Are you doing everything you're supposed to be doing? Are you doing everything the way you're supposed to be doing it? It's making sure that you just have that connection and that you're able to remember all that you are supposed to be doing in one of these designer review decisions. If you do not have a good rules of procedure, go ahead and update them. Some communities just use Robert's Rules of Order and just roll with it. In some cases, people need to come up with an actual document that gives a guideline for your own process. Some will go with this as just an internal document of, who makes a motion, who can make a motion, what's a quorum. Others do a document that's more outward focused that will actually say, you as a property owner, this is what you need to expect at the meeting. But in general, it's some document that you need to be reviewed that actually is that outward facing. And then finally, make sure you do a review of your design guidelines. I'll get into a little more detail on those in a moment, but just making sure that, again, you're making your decisions in accordance with all of those different design review aspects of your program. Now we're actually going to get into the work of the Preservation Commission. Most people say, well, isn't it just design review? No. First step you really need to do after actually getting yourself set up in your ordinance and set up as a commission is actually to do survey. What in the world do you actually have in your community? What does it look like? What's its condition? What is almost at 50 years old, almost 50 years old? That's generally the cutoff line for properties. And then you use that information to determine, are there logical landmarks or districts? And the reason we say almost 50 is because it's a rolling deadline. And it's important to update it regularly because, again, that's a rolling deadline. This year, 1972 is considered an eligible year for designation. Next year, it's 1973. That a lot of new buildings, there was a lot of construction in those years, and therefore you need to be prepared for whether any of those are significant in your community and may actually be worthy of designation and protection. In some cases, it's pretty obvious when you have just a small historic district. This is part of a much larger district in the Salina. This is what you would ultimately be wanting to create, which is the historic district map, which, if you'll notice, includes both contributing and non-contributing resources. Several of those squares are not colored in, which means that those are non-contributing properties. So local designation would apply to those as infill or for work, but it's the buildings that are grayed in that would be the most significant for actual design review in your historic district. So take this example, this is in Bellefontaine. Clearly that PNC Bank is a non-contributing property within the historic district. I admit I've used this slide for quite a while now, and that building is kind of growing on me. But from the perspective, since it's probably 80s, maybe early 90s, it would not be considered eligible for historic designation. However, it still would fall within the boundaries of the historic district. It's part of this block, and there's more blocks around this. This is right near the courthouse, historic square area. So if this building were to be modified, it still would have to go before the Historic Preservation Commission, but clearly it's not going to have some of the same requirements as the Italianate contributing buildings beside it. You're not going to be able to put, though, a 15-story addition on the top of this building, or you would not necessarily be able to do a gigantic LED sign that's going to light up everything around it. It's important that it still has to be, any work that would be done to this non-contributing building would still be reflective of the nature of the historic district around it. And in some cases, you do have individual landmarks. This is actually out in the park, so a little harder to designate. This is a historic furnace, and this would be potentially designated individually. It is important for commissions to think about properties like this if they are within your municipal boundaries. It's also important to think about archaeological sites because Ohio was populated long before Europeans moved in, and therefore there are going to be, in a lot of these town sites, some archaeological resources, plus the fact that some of these have been inhabited for a few hundred years. by Europeans. There's also going to be archaeology associated with those communities. And so it's important to have some knowledge of the archaeology, and that those resources may also need to be protected by your ordinance. Once you've got your designation, you know what you've got. So then your next step is to go into design review. This is where you're actually protecting the historic character and the fabric of your designated landmarks and districts. And I keep emphasizing fabric because that historic fabric, that original wood, that original roofing, those brick walls are what's actually historic. Those are the elements of the building that are actually historic. If you've replaced everything, then something ends up becoming historic looking as opposed to an actual historic building. Our goal is to actually protect that historic fabric in addition to that historic character. Your design review is also reflecting what, again, is significant about the properties. I mentioned Glendale and I mentioned Lebanon. Are these other properties designated, and are those different elements actually going to fall under design review? In this case, it may also provide, are you only looking at the front of a building? This would have to be set up by your ordinance, but would you be only looking at the front? Or are you also going to be looking at 360 view of each historic property? I've seen commissions that do both. So that would have to be a local decision. Any local design review would also be looking at parameters for new construction. It's important that new work fit in with that historic district. And then also the overall goal is making sure that development is going to be sympathetic. It's guiding development. Historic preservation, as the next webinar states, hysterical. People think we want to just freeze everything in amber and not have anything change. That's not the case. We, of course, want to see things develop. We want to see things come back. We're just hoping that we can reuse the historic buildings and that we can guide new development so that it'll be sympathetic with what's still existing. When you're doing design review, again, you're looking at character defining elements. This is in Haydenville, which was, I actually double checked this morning, the last entirely company owned company town in the world. I believe it was world, if not just Ohio, where the company actually owned all the houses and did all the construction. They were later in the 70s able to buy the houses, but everything was built by the same company using the exact same materials. Everything from the general store to the church was built with the same materials. That siding and that building material is a character defining element of those historic buildings. Typically, when most communities are dealing with design review, they're looking at applying the standards for rehabilitation. I'm not going to go through all 10. Basically, though, they boil down to preserving historic character, emphasizing repair versus the replacement of historic fabric, and then compatibility of new elements, new designs, and new construction. It does apply to all types of buildings. So whether you have a church building, a government building, or just your typical main street, or you have a house, it does apply to all of those. And again, it's protecting the historic character of mostly just the exteriors. I do have one commission that looks at interiors. And if you are applying these standards, they're used actually for a number of different programs. If you're looking though from, for example, the tax credit perspective, it is also looking at the interior of the building. That's why I say mostly. The standards are widely used, but for most commission purposes, it's just looking at that exterior of the building. So those standards though, they can sometimes be a little bit hard to understand or hard to apply to different kinds of buildings. So communities will often create what's called design guidelines. Our hope is that these design guidelines are then passed through the local uh, village or city council, but in general, they are a document that helps both property owners and the commission. Property owners will understand what they need to do, what they need to consider if they're proposing a change to their historic building. For the commission, these help provide you with additional information on one, what to expect, and two, how to apply those standards in a more consistent way. So for example, here is how we typically look at windows. If a window replacement is necessary, these are the elements you're going to look at. Or if you have an Italianate style building, what are the different character defining elements of that building that are going to make sure that we protect that historic character if something needs to change. You can have design guidelines that are either community-wide. Some places will do design guidelines related to specific historic districts. And then others will do residential versus just commercial. And also some individual landmarks will get their own set of design guidelines. They're a little less frequent, but if a building is significant enough, it can get its own design guidelines. There are grants available to produce these documents, and our website at the SHPO does have a consultants list that lists people who have experience in doing design guidelines. So if you have design review, this is something I highly recommend that is helpful, again, both to the public and to you as an individual. If you're looking at replacement materials, in some cases, this is stuff that even your guidelines would not check, even if they're new. And you need to take a look at them from this perspective. First and foremost, since you're trying to protect that historic character and historic fabric, have all your maintenance and repair options actually been exhausted? If not, they need to consider those. It's also important to determine if replacements are going to actually be cost effective. Do they wear out? Do they actually perform well in your area? You might have a new window type or some new siding that performs extraordinarily well in Phoenix, Arizona. But let's face it, if you're up in Ashtabula or up in Port Clinton, where you have Lake Erie to contend with, it may not last quite as long or have quite the same hardiness that it would in Phoenix, Arizona. And so it's important at the end to just carefully and deliberately determine if those replacements might actually be a reasonable choice. Because sometimes they are. Sometimes manufacturers hit something that's just absolutely spectacular and it will work, and sure, it might actually be a worthwhile replacement. Windows are windows. They seem like such a simple thing, and yet so often this is what we see. Great repairable historic window is replaced with the hardware store special, where they have to insert that bit of plywood to make it fit because, well, the special doesn't include a nice arched top. Windows are a really delicate thing. It's important to consider that materials, you're never going to get windows that are going to last quite that long, and that you also want to make sure you have windows that actually meet that historic look of the building, because these kind of look sleepy. They kind of look kind of droopy because they have that plywood at the top versus the very nice original windows that, at least from this look, could have been repaired and probably were a little bit cheaper to be repaired. It's also important to apply those standards to any infill design. making sure that these new construction fit into the historic district. What's the character of the district? For example, do you have a historic residential district that may have had corner stores? I've seen this in plenty of places. Or was the district known for a diverse architectural types? Making sure that whatever you're proposing has that compatibility with the district. Making sure that any new construction also has the material scale, setback, and height. Does it actually feel and fit in with the rhythm of the historic district? And then also making sure that any and all relevant zoning and code considerations are met. So for example, if you're in a commercial district, some communities have a blanket new construction requirement that a building be set back. This is where it's important for you to work with the local planning department or zoning department, because if you're on a main street, you probably don't want the building set back a far distance from the sidewalk. You want it to match and be right up to the sidewalk, so it's actually helping create that unified front. So it's making sure that you obey the other relevant codes, but that you also work with them to make sure that the codes allow what would be an appropriate historic building. So here we have a residential district. Clearly this building is a new construction. Sorry, this is a little dark, but you can see this one has a garage in the front. They had to actually do a new curb cut and a new driveway. It's set back further than any other building, and it very clearly sticks out. As opposed on a Main Street related scene, where the second building in, the one that is in buff brick, is actually the addition to the Louis Sullivan Bank at the end of the block. I don't know what happened to the building there, but this was new construction as a new addition to the bank, and they were able to come in and create a building that blended in with the historic districts. Now, it has traditional design features, but it definitely has a few things that tell you this is new construction on the block. Signs and signage are something I get a lot of questions about. First and foremost, making sure that you meet any other ordinance requirements. It's also important to make sure that you have the details of the signs that are coming in. Are these the kinds of signs that are moving? Do they have interior or exterior lights? Are they one of those LED signs that will positively blind you when you drive past at night? Making sure that you have that information about what kinds of signs are being proposed, and then to make sure that the local examples that they're actually going to fit in. So in the upper example, we have Mansfield's. The City News clearly is the historic sign. So the Coney place behind it had some precedence to do that type of board sign. So it fit in, it was relevant to the historic district. And I believe in that area, which is near the Carousel Historic District, has a couple of other signs. Versus down below where we have both the Sherwin-Williams signs, which are just pasted on internally lit plastic, and then also on the building one door up, with the green awning. That would have been an appropriate awning for that style of building. It would have had something a little less suburban. They very easily could have done the awning style beside it and done something that would have been a lot more compatible with the historic districts. And then again, you're always going to come up with someone who has some brand new material or brand new issue that you can't use precedents to look at, that there's just nothing you can think of that's actually going to fit, and it's just out there entirely. So it's important that you look at the visual impact of whatever this new material or issue is and seeing how it blends in. If you're within a historic district, is it a compatible treatment? Is it removable? How does it fit in with the standards? And then finally, what's the cumulative impact? A part of this is also looking, is this a change that a lot of other people will end up looking for and pushing for? Because in some cases, that will allow a lot of problems to arise. You want to make sure that you're not going to have a negative cumulative impact. And then we're going to look finally at some additional resources. First, I always have to talk up the personal program that I work with the most, which is the Certified Local Government Program. This is a federal, state, and local partnership that acknowledges the importance of local historic preservation. It is a voluntary program where you have a local historic preservation commission whose ordinance meets state and federal requirements, which are, quite frankly, not terribly onerous. They usually include, you have a survey system, you have qualified members on your board, and elements like that. Nothing terribly wild and crazy. And then there is a biennial review of the work that you're doing as a commission. We're just checking in, seeing if you need help, and making sure that you're actually adhering to your ordinance. The benefit of the program is you do have access to grants and assistance from our office, from the State Historic Preservation Office. The CLG grants are created to help support local preservation efforts. So either the city or a local nonprofit are able to apply for these. This includes everything from design guidelines to bricks and mortar work, what is actually important to historic preservation in the community. They're awarded annually, and we have roughly $100,000 available each year. Depending upon the year, it can be incredibly competitive. In other years, it's not very competitive at all. But it's 7 to 12 awards between 8 and 25,000. They are 60-40 matching reimbursement grants, so the money comes at the end of the program. And the 60 is what we are paying out, the 40 is what you are paying in. However, there are some grants that do not have a match if they meet certain program requirements or program goals, which vary yearly. Also important to note, if you are looking to do more local historic preservation, there is the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. Registration is open for the NAPC Forum, which is down in Cincinnati this year. It's a reasonably priced conference. I'm going to be there along with a few other SHPO staff. It's a nationwide conference, so it's really important to get that perspective from other states and how you can do preservation and how what you're doing fits in the national scale. And also helps provide you with tours and just information on how preservation is being done on the commission level across the entire United States. And then I wanted to kind of finish off with just a couple other funding things. These will be in the recording, and just so you're aware of them, is rehabilitation tax credits or something some commissions deal with, which is just a 20% credit or a 25% credit on the work that's being done. We can have, if you need, you can contact me for more information on these programs, but this is something, especially on a main street, that you might look into and have coming up. But basically, it's looking at credits for rehabilitation work on historic properties. Then also there's the pipeline program, which is looking for projects that might be tax credit eligible, and it can involve grant money for listing buildings or a district, or if you have a metal screen, for example, in front of a building in the National Register District, it actually can be for removing that metal screen. Most of this program, though, is operated outside of the Department of Development. And then just a couple of parting thoughts. One thing to always consider, preservation is a long-term solution. Just because you do designation or design review, it's not going to fix everything in that first little bit. It's a very long-term, long process. It's important to bring in as much help as you can. Make sure that you have other commissions or other boards involved. The local government has to be involved. What is their appetite for the work that you're doing? Making sure that everyone is on the same page. Learn your local politics. Is this something that your local government wants, or do you need to consider other options that may not be a regular preservation commission? Finding a way that you're going to make sure you fit in with the local politics, and then just make sure you keep yourself up to date. All right, Ray can call or dial in. We can open this up for questions.
Thanks, Nathan. Boy, that is a lot to take in, and it's never easy, right? I mean, there's so much when
I
you're
could have sat there
involved
and
in.
had 10 more slides, but I wanted to make sure we had question time.
Yep, yep. So great that you gave a shameless plug for Forum, and really National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. There's no reason that any design review board in the state of Ohio should not be members for the great publications that they do. They have a listserv that alone is worth the price of admission, where you can ask questions and basically get the best input from design review leaders across the country. And CLG, let's kick off with a sort of a CLG related question. Chris says, hi Nathan, are the grants to create design guidelines separate from CLG grants?
In most cases, the ones we see are CLG grants are the ones that are used for design guidelines. I'm not sure. I didn't bring up History Fund just because it's a little more bricks and mortar. I don't think that is eligible for design guidelines, but CLG grant is explicitly that is the main fund for design guidelines, yes.
Okay. Greg says, great presentation. And he asked if this will be available. And yes, Greg, we have a YouTube channel that you can search by typing Heritage Ohio. And this presentation should probably be available on our YouTube channel within the next couple days. So you should be able to view it there. And Devin, if you're still listening, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't all of the attendees also receive an email link to the presentation that they can access?
Correct.
I think that's the case. Oh, thanks, Devin. So, right. So you'll get that link, and just click on that link. You'll be able to replay the video, the audio, the visual part of it, and you are welcome to share out with anyone you would like to. Heather asks a question, which comes first in your experience, design guidelines or local designation, and then any range on the cost for producing, I think, either the ordinance or the design guidelines? And then I would like to tack onto that. And Nathan, have you seen where communities who are totally starting from scratch, do you suggest maybe a National Register district where there's an opportunity to use the incentives and then design review coming along later, or maybe that's not as important of a priority?
Design guidelines versus designation. I would recommend designation simply because how do you know what the design guidelines need to address if you don't have something designated? If your district is primarily residential, then you may not need to go into, for example, or let me correct that. If you're dealing with a primarily wood frame construction historic district, residential district, you don't need to go into, for example, a lot on masonry. So you need to know what you're actually going to protect versus if you're going into a Main Street historic district where primarily it's commercial buildings and most of them are masonry, then yeah, you're going to have to cover more masonry issues with that kind of a situation. And so, yeah, I would say do the designation first, or at least know where you're going with it. I have seen this come up lately. People want to see what they're getting into when they get into this before they acquiesce to being locally designated. Um, I don't know how to get around that other than looking potentially at other communities that have similar guidelines that, we're not doing anything that's much radically different. But generally speaking, you need to know what you're protecting before you go that protection route. What was the second part of that, Frank? I know your part.
Yeah, whether you've seen in your experience that there's a step-by-step process where if someone's starting from scratch, you're like, see if you're National Register eligible as a district, get your National Register listing in, and go from there.
I think that can be a good start for setting out the path for that. The National Register is a good guide, but some communities, their local designation is wider or a bigger footprint than that historic district, because for local districts, the state's not coming in and telling you what you have to do, so you can make it bigger or smaller, whatever you would like to do. And some communities like to have more of a buffer zone. So, if you take the very distinct square, you might go a block or so off of that to kind of take in some of those rough edges, because one, those might be historic districts or historic buildings that are in those rough edges. And two, you may want to have some say in what's going to go in those areas should development eventually spring over the lines of the historic district into that surrounding area. So you may not want to have poor design that goes outside of that. So,
Okay.
it depends on what the political will is. But yes, a lot of communities do use the National Register. And I think another part of the question, though, was what the cost is.
Right,
And
yeah.
And I'm afraid I don't know off the top of my head. Ordinances typically are kind of done in-house. I have model ordinance language, and I will work with the community to get them to an ordinance that meets the CLG requirements. But design guidelines, survey, and stuff like that, honestly, it changes pretty radically on what kind of the going rate is. If you get someone who's newer, or if you can do some of it in-house and then have that work farmed out, the cleanup and the prettiness. It's hard to say 100% what the actual cost is. And then I admit, I don't actually administer the grant portion, so I don't see the dollar signs quite as frequently.
Okay, good point on there's a spectrum. You can either toss it all in a consultant's lap, or if you have some expertise at the local level, there are ways to definitely save some money on that process here and there.
And yeah, and it also depends on how detailed it is. I mean, over the Rhine in Cincinnati is going to be a whole different ball game than, one of these lovely courthouse squares where it's primarily 5 or 6 streets or something, and, a very limited number of resources.
All right. David says he has a downtown business district, mainly commercial buildings. And he says the town is in the process of applying to be listed on the historical register as a historic district. And I'm not sure if that's at the national level or local level. He asked, do we have to have a local historical commission?
If it's National Register, no. Even unless you're going for something like CLG, you can technically have a local historic district. It just, if you don't have a commission, it's just honorary. It's not really going to have much say necessarily in what's going on. You can get a historic marker or something, but if you're on the National Register, it does open the property up to tax credits and the like. But no, unless you explicitly create the commission at the local level, you don't have to worry about me coming to town and doing the design guidelines and design review and all of that. You would have to create that commission for any of that kind of stuff.
I see David mentioned that he's looking at the national level. So
yeah, so no commissions needed for national register. There's plenty of towns, plenty of individual landmarks throughout the state of Ohio. No commission attached whatsoever.
All right. Greg says, we had a perfect project, but was killed by neighborhood NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. And he says, any advice for next time? That is a tantalizing question, Greg, but that might be too skinny on the details for Nathan to answer, but I'll throw it to you anyways, Nathan.
I mean, it depends on what their, it does depend on what their actual problem was. Sometimes there's stuff that, well, one, preservation can't solve everything. If it was, they're objecting to low-income housing or something of that nature, there's a bigger problem that needs to be looked at, a bigger issue that needs to be considered in doing those kinds of projects. Just from a preservation perspective, it's just being out there and being early and being honest. There's, not knowing this, but again, yeah, kind of like you said, Frank, it's kind of, without some of the details, it's kind of hard to solidly answer. But
sorry to interrupt you guys for a second. Greg did add, it's an old school in the middle of a residential district.
Yeah, one of those. Basically, some of that it runs into, it's probably a parking question. It's not easy to answer those. It's pushing it. You may have to do additional stuff to help show what that would be, like a parking study or something like that. But it's kind of hard to 100%. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Greg, that would be a perfect question to put on the Preservation Commission's listserv and ask if other commissions throughout the country, what they did to help win the day for those places that did have maybe a neighborhood school and maybe there was an affordable housing component to it. How did they convince the district stakeholders to go along with that kind of preservation option? There might even be Ohio examples who could help shed some light on how they were successful.
I'm thinking right now off the top of my head, kind of in the tax side of things, I'm like, I know plenty of schools that have successfully done housing. So, it is done all the time throughout the state.
Right. And that's a good point. It's possible.
So my email is still up. If someone wants to email me a more specific question or a call or something, we can definitely set something up.
Very true. So Heather, along that same line of questioning, she's asking about estimated costs for guidelines, to hire a firm to write them, especially assuming that most communities do not have the capacity to do these. And Sam mentioned that, Sam in Oxford said that their preservation ordinance update cost $10,000, which included some staff work along with consultant costs. One thing that I wanted to check with you, Nathan, for CLG grants that are typically on design guidelines, is that information public so that you could maybe provide costs that communities have incurred?
I believe so. I believe they can either go through me or contact our main line. They can get a hold with Adam Eltrich, who's our grants manager. I believe they can get that because most stuff that comes in our office ends up being public record. 10,000 for an ordinance rewrite doesn't sound unreasonable. And typically the grants can be up to about 25. We've seen them actually go a bit higher. So You can ask for a lot. Just be prepared. It may not be the full amount if you do the grant.
Okay. Jana asks, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, yeah, it all depends.
Right, yeah. Jana asks, if you have a conflict of interest and you recuse yourself from voting, why is it unethical to speak on the file if you do not vote? Aren't you just the general public with an opinion at that point? Interesting question.
Well, when you're making the vote, that's still potentially influencing the decision. And if you are saying, if you were coming in and you were a member of that board making that decision or making those statements, your opinion technically probably has more weight than Joe Schmo architect that they don't know. Because you're on the commission, if someone in the commission sees something that they may not agree with, you can kind of say, well, I'm on the commission too, and I think it's fine. And your statement would weigh more than, another architect who's coming in who's not on that commission and saying that I think this design is fine. Being on the commission gives your voice a slightly different weight. That's just where I see that conflict of interest coming in, that sitting on the commission gives you a different weight to your voice. And it's just important that to have some of that division from that. That's why I generally am like, that's best with, like, if it's that kind of a situation, not to be involved. I understand it's technically you're a member of the public, but you're a member of the public if you're on the board also. Kind of, it's a very tricky thing.
Well, and by its definition, a conflict of interest is the disclosure that you as a person have something to gain by the decision going in your favor. And so, you can say, I'm taking off my design review board member hat and putting on my public person's hat, but that doesn't necessarily change you as a person still having something to gain from the decision going forward. So I think that's maybe an important distinction to make in that conflict of interest. And maybe there's a case where you might think you have a conflict of interest and maybe it really doesn't exist. Maybe it's not as much of a conflict as you think it is for whatever reason.
Quite frankly, that's where I used the advice my brother gave me on dealing with my car headlights when I didn't have automatic ones. If you have to ask the question, go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
And it sounds kind of goofy, but it actually works. If you have to ask the question, is this maybe an issue? Go ahead and do it. We've done that plenty of times when we've had grant-related discussions, like on the CLG grants, because I sit on that committee as a non-voting member. But if a grant has something to do with something I deal with, I leave the room. Someone has to come get me when I'm done. If there is any question of impropriety, it's best to just go with it.
Yep, good point. Heather asks, who or what questions help to best determine if a building is considered contributing or non-contributing?
It depends on if you're going from a local historic district, typically it's going to be within the boundaries of the district and what type of district it is. This is somewhere where actually doing National Register ahead of time can actually be really helpful. But what you're looking at is, does this building still tell its story within the context of the historic district? It might have bad things done to the storefront. That's 90% of what we see. It might have some bad windows, but if you look at the historic district and you can still see how this building fits into that historic story, then it would probably be considered contributing. If you look at it, and that's where the problem with like those metal screens on the front of buildings come in. There's gone. There's nothing left. You can't see anything. There might be something left underneath. You don't know. But with that metal screen, you can't tell. So it's making sure that you actually are able, does that building still tell that story? Now, thing people really don't want to hear is in some cases, those metal screens are now considered historic, since a lot of them are going away and some of them are really well done. So scary as that sounds, that also tell a very good story about your downtown district. That in the 1960s, while there was urban renewal going on, some of these buildings tried to modernize and fit in with the new modern style. And that tells a very good story.
Yeah, you mentioned early on, 1972 is this year's cutoff for 50 years, and if that is what your district uses as a cutoff, then it's very easy, I guess, to argue that those cheese grater facades have become historic in their own right.
Now, some of those have been done so poorly, and if it has trees growing out of it, it's probably not. But we've all seen examples of really spectacular metal screens. I mean, I can always think of one. Everyone will laugh because it's obviously a New Orleans example, and that's my favorite city. But there was one on Canal Street. It was a amazingly well done 1960 screen, really great lettering on it. It was just really well done. However, the problem, quote unquote, is that the building behind it was one of the largest and first owned black mercantile firms, I think. It was something very, very significant property, and it was still there behind it. And, they worked through the historic designation process and the rehab process, and they're like, we want to bring it back to showcase that history as opposed to this, basically metal screen that's in front of it. And that's where it was just, on the one hand, I felt bad seeing that sign go. On the other hand, seeing that history told right on one of them, downtown, right near the river, Canal Street, New Orleans, was pretty impressive to see that coming back.
And that opens up a whole new can of worms that preservationists can argue over for hours on rehabilitation or restoration. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time, so that will have to wait for another day in the future. But at this point, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the first of our 2 Design Review Preservation Month webinars. I hope you will sign up and plan on joining us next on Tuesday, May 24th. Nathan alluded to it, how not to become the hysterical Design Review Board. We have Sam from Oxford joining us and Mary from Ashtabula joining us. We are going to delve into the good and the bad and the ugly of design review, and hopefully we'll all come out of it with a lot of great tools to help in our ongoing fight for preserving our downtown. So, any parting thoughts, Nathan? Any last words?
If you need to contact me, I have more questions. My email's still on the screen, so send me an email.
All right, great. And with that, I'll wish everyone a good afternoon. Thanks for joining us, and have a great Preservation Month.
Thank you.